Thank you, Swati, and welcome everyone to the June edition of our DMS Technical Assistance Call. We're making great progress on our DMS protocols and are excited to share two of them with you today: integrated monitoring and sustaining compliance and improvement. But the first part of today's call will be devoted to responding to the many questions from the field we've been getting about the IDEA American Rescue Plan, or ARP, funds provided by Congress to supplement the regular IDEA formula allocations. In addition to information we'll be providing today, we will be releasing an ARP funds fact sheet on or about July 1st, so stay alert for that. I wanted to mention that Osep has released its 2021 annual determinations this week. The Part C determinations and SPP APR responses were released on Tuesday, and then the Part B determinations just a few hours ago. So if you are a state director or Part C coordinator, you should have gotten the email notifying you that those were available through EMAPS. Hats off to our Jennifer Wolfsheimer and Christine Pilgrim and the incredible team here in Osep for completing this major task on time. Folks here have been working around the clock in order to meet these deadlines. Your Osep state lead will be reaching out to you to schedule a time to walk you through our SPP APR responses and determinations letters and answer any questions that you might have. One last announcement. I want to remind you that our virtual Osep Leadership and Project Directors Conference will be held July 19th through 22nd. So if you haven't done so already, please be sure that you register for this event. Because we'll have lots of opportunities to engage with you during the conference, we will not be having our regular Osep monthly TA call or our monthly DMS call during the month of July. So that's it for my announcement. Before we get started with the formal presentation, I want to introduce our Acting Osep Director and Acting Assistant Secretary, David Cantrell, who will share a few words with us. David?
Thank you, Greg. Good afternoon, everyone. I cannot believe that it is almost the end of June, and I hope all of you are continuing to take care of yourselves, your families, and stay safe and healthy. As Greg said, our Osep team has been tremendously busy over the last, actually quite several months, and we're really excited that the SPP APR determinations were issued this week. And I'm really excited about the content of today's presentation. As Greg said, we've received, and understandably so, many questions about the uses of funds for the American Rescue Plan, additional funds that we received this year. You know, we're very fortunate to receive this bump up in funds, but I understand that you have many, many questions. So we have a robust team here today to answer your questions, so I'm looking forward to the next hour's discussions. If many of you participated in yesterday's First Equity Summit with our Deputy Secretary, Cindy Martin, you may have heard her mention that we are in OSERS gearing up to issue several pieces of guidance for back to school for school year 21-22. Our team has been actively working behind the scenes over the last month to identify what are some topics based on input we've received from many of you, not only in this spring, but quite frankly, since the pandemic began, topics where we know we need to provide further clarification in the education of infants, toddlers, children, and youth with disabilities. So our team has been actively working on developing guidance documents, and we are planning to issue those in several phases, with the first of which being in mid-August, in time for the start of the school year, and the second one towards the end of August or in September. So look forward for those guidance documents to be issued, and of course we'll follow up with technical assistance conversations addressing many of those topics as well. And lastly, regarding any update for political staff joining the OSERS leadership team, I don't have any updates at this point. I continue to serve in the acting role as acting director in OSEP, And, my normal job is the Deputy Director at Osep, but it's been a pleasure to serve in this position. And under Greg's leadership, Osep and MSIP in particular has made significant progress. So it's a pleasure working with Greg and all of his team. So with that, I'll turn it over to Matt Sneer, who will kick off the conversation. Matt?
Great. Thank you, David, and thank you, Greg, and thank you all for joining us today. We've got a lot of information to share with you today, so I'll try to get through this first slide fairly quickly. As both Greg and David mentioned, we're going to start off by providing some additional information around the ARP Act IDA funds. A lot of the information I'm going to be sharing was in the email that Greg sent last week, but we're going to add a little bit to that. And we also were able to get a special guest star today. We have a colleague from our budget office, Stephen Bird, who is joining me just to help me answer any questions that I can't answer. We work hand in glove to try to get the funds out, and I really appreciate Stephen taking the time to be with us today. After we get through the ARP Act IDA funds, what we're going to do, and going to be very excited to do so, is to unveil our first new set of DMS 2.0 protocols, the Integrated Monitoring and Sustaining Compliance and Improvement Protocols. We'll talk a little bit about the feedback we got from you all through focus groups that TA centers did run, and then a little bit about provide an overview of the protocol and some of the next steps on the protocol. I just want to mention that this will be our first blush at talking about these new protocols. We will provide links for them. You'll be able to take a look at them for yourself, and then we'll come back to them to talk about them in more detail later this summer or early next fall. So stay tuned for that. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, the American Rescue Plan, or the ARP Act IDA funds. I want to thank you all for your patience as we work through this. Just again, I've said this a few times, but I want to repeat it. The context is that the decision to add in the provision providing for these funds to the ARP Act was at a very last minute. And so we have had to take some time to make sure we understood all of the legal ramifications and get everything right. So we appreciate all of the patience you've had while we've been a little slower than we would like to get out the information and had to do a couple of iterations of sending out the allocations. Our first intent was to try to give you the best idea we could of an estimate of what funds you are going to get, and then to provide the most accurate information possible from there. So the allocations that we sent out are now the final allocations. As Greg mentioned, we anticipate a fact sheet will be coming out very short order. So we hope all of this will be helpful as we move forward. Okay, next slide, please. So just a couple of very quick reminders and considerations. As I've said a few times and others have said, the ARP Act funds are IDA funds fundamentally. They follow all of the same requirements for the use of funds as for IDA. The period of availability is the same as the FFY21 funds, so they must be obligated by September 30th, 2023 and expended by January 28th, 2024. These are all basics, but they're worth repeating as I've been told by others, so I'll keep on repeating that. Next slide, please. And some additional considerations to think about as you think about how you at the state level and your local programs may want to consider using the funds. Remember that these are additional IDA funds. We know that the president has budget includes a very high level of funds for both IDA Part B and Part C moving forward, but we don't know what that level of funding will ultimately be. So when you think about using these funds, consider sustainability, so that when you're using these funds, think about things that you will be able to sustain without those additional funds moving forward. We also urge you to consider the focus on challenges from the pandemic. This is the context within which these funds were introduced into the American Rescue Plan. So consider things addressing challenges such as school entry, the disruption in the education of children with disabilities. And I would note that this can include, if an IEP team determines that there is a need, paying for compensatory services or other things that might be done to address that disruption. Also consider the mental health impact on students with disabilities and what types of mental health services need to be added. And we also urge you to think about equity in special education and early intervention services. Equity is baked into IDA, but it is of particular focus these days, as we all know, and we want to think about ways to make sure that we're spending the money in an equitable way, addressing issues of equity through special education, whether it's through identification, services, discipline, other things along those lines. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so as I mentioned, all of the final allocation tables have been sent out to you by email. They're also posted on the link that's here in the PowerPoint on our IDA sites.ed.gov site. The Part C and Part B Section 619 final tables were sent in an email from Greg on June 4th, 2021. We sent out revised Section 611 tables in an email on June 16th, 2021, last week. Okay, next slide, please. So a few things that we've been asked about. So all of the ARP Act IDA funds will have separate CFDA numbers and grant notices. They have what we call alphas. So for 611 funds, for example, the CFDA, the normal CFDA is 84.027. There will be, for the ARP IDA Section 611 funds, it is 84.027X for extra funds. That's what that stands for, and et cetera, for both the 619 and Part C. You will get separate GANs or grant notices for your regular IDA awards and your ARP Act IDA awards. And your subgrants, as we'll talk about a little bit more, should be treated the same. Next slide, please. Okay, for Part B, Section 611 state set-aside funds, what you see on the screen is the text from our regulation that talks about how these funds are calculated. This wording it takes a while to understand, but the basics of it is that any increases to state set-aside funds for Section 611 are based on the rate of inflation. They are not governed by additional funds such as the ARP Act funds. So despite the fact that there are significantly more funds available for IDA Section 611 through ARP Act, that does not increase the amount of funds that a state may reserve for state level activities for Section 611. That's just baked into the regulations and the statute. Next slide, please. However, this was something that we got a little bit wrong. We did not recognize initially, at least some of us didn't, that for Section 619, it functions slightly different. So again, I have the regulation on the slide here. Again, it's complicated to understand the words, but the bottom line is that for Section 619, the state level funds, the funds that may reserve for at the state level, any increases are determined through a combination of an increase in a state allocation as well as inflation, whichever is the lesser. And what it comes out to is that there is a very slight increase in the funds that states may reserve from Section 619 based on the ARP funds through these provisions, and those are reflected in the tables that we have sent out to you. Okay, next slide, please. So the tables sent out on June 16th, as I've mentioned, are correct and final. We had to make a few adjustments over the last couple of months based on a few different things. There were a couple of calculation issues in the original allocation table that didn't affect the total allocation, that is how much you were getting between ARP funds July 1 and October 1 all together, but did affect the distribution of the regular IDA funds between July 1 and the October 1 payment. So we had to make those adjustments. There was, in addition, a change that had to be made due to the fact that there was one state that we had to reduce their grant for due to a failure to maintain state financial support. As a result, every other state got a slight increase in their allocations. So that, again, is reflected in the June 16th totals that we sent out. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, the grants that we are sending out will come under two separate GANs. And as you send out the funds, the sub-awards, the sub-grants to your LEAs for Part B, this should follow similarly. So you must meet all the federal award identification requirements that are in the uniform guidance at the citation that's listed there. That includes giving essentially a separate GANs as well to your LEAs. LEAs are not required to submit separate applications for regular IDA Part B funds or the additional ARP and the additional ARP Act IDA funds, but states must ensure that both the SCA and the LEA can account for and track the use of IDA ARP Act funds separately from your regular IDA funds. You'll be reporting through the normal mechanism of FFATA through USA spending on that. Okay, next slide, please. So in terms of the way you calculate your LEA allocations, the IDA funds that are awarded under the ARP Act are not a separate grant award program. Even though there's a separate GAN, it's the same grant award. They serve as a supplement to the FFY 2021 regular IDA funds. Because of that, the ARP Act IDA funds don't affect the LEA's base payment, which is the first part of the calculations that you do. They'll get the same base payment as they do. So when you're calculating your LEA funds, you first must make the base payments as you normally do, and then allocate all of the remaining Section 611 and Section 619 funds based on population and poverty, as it is cited there. Okay, and we can go on to the next slide, please. I want to highlight a couple of things about some selected LEA requirements that we've been asked about. These are requirements that require some sort of calculations based on the total IDA subaward. And in all of these instances, the calculations should include an aggregate amount of both the IDA FFY 21 funds and the ARP Act IDA funds. So this includes calculations that you have to do when an LEA is required to reserve funds for comprehensive coordinated early intervening services, and when you're doing proportionate share. So you would add together all of the funds together. And by the way, we'll be providing some additional information on this through our fact sheet and additional guidance that we'll be providing in the coming months. Thank you. Next slide, please. Also want to mention the LEA MOE adjustment or reduction, as I think most of you in Part B are aware, under 300.205, when there is an increase in federal funds, this provision kicks in, which allows for LEAs to reduce their MOE level for up to 50%. But there are some important provisos about that I want to make sure you're aware of. First of all, LEAs must meet requirements. They must have a determination that they meet requirements to take this adjustment. And I think it's really essential that SEAs maintain the integrity of the determinations process. We know that when this happened during the Recovery Act under ARA, there were some concerns that there were changes to the determinations process to allow more LEAs to reduce their MOE. And I've heard from some states that there is some pressure to do something similarly. Our message then and now is the same, that your determinations process should remain the same and should not be adjusted to it for that purposes. For LEAs that do take this adjustment, are able to do this, all those freed up funds must be spent on activities that are allowable under the Elementary Secondary Education Act, and SEAs should be prepared to monitor and track those funds. I will note that our Office of the Inspector General did a number of audits during the era, finding that there were some states that were not doing that. So that's something that you should be paying attention to. Should also note that the funds expended for voluntary CAIS or coordinated early intervening services has an interplay with the amount that LEAs may reduce their MOE, as it reduces the maximum amount that may be reduced. So there, take a look at the information in the appendix of the Part B regulations to determine how that is done. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so for Part C states, and thank you for being patient as we've worked through the Part B. This is mostly information that we've already provided, but want to go over it again. We know that we asked you to provide a revised Section 3 or use of funds section for your regular IDA funds. That was due on June 18th. We have also asked you to provide an additional Section 3 for the ARP Act IDA funds, and that is due to us on August 2nd. I also want to note that we recognize that it is challenging to plan for how best to use these funds and get the appropriate amount of feedback from your stakeholders, and that just want to note that you have an opportunity to make changes to your budget if you need to after you submit this information, as long as you follow the requirements for receiving prior approval from Osep under as specified in this regulation. That process is fairly streamlined. If it's something you need to do, just get in touch with your state lead. Also want to note, as we've been asked about this, that the use of fund sections should reflect the total amount that you are proposing to expend over the entire period of the availability of IDA FFY 21 award, as well as the ARP allocations. You don't do it for 1 year at a time, you do it for the entire period. Thank you. Next slide. Okay, now in terms of outlying areas under Part B, this all gets a little bit complicated. There are varying provisions within the statute and the regulations that govern how some of our entities get their funds. And for Part B outlying areas, the department has some discretion, and using that discretion, the department decided to increase the amount of funds that were reserved for Part B programs in the outlying area, consistent with the increased IDA Section 611 funds provided by the ARP Act. So the bottom line is that the Part B outlying areas receive a separate ARP Act IDA section funding for that, and they get a separate GAN for that as well. There is a little bit of a distinction in the state set-aside funds for the outlying areas for the reasons that are described in that bullet, but I won't go through the details. The bottom line is that there is an increase in the maximum amount for state administration as a result of the additional ARP Act IDA Section 611 funds for the outlying areas, unlike for most of the states there. Okay, next slide, please. For the outlying areas for Part C, the Part C programs in the outlying areas were provided an increase in their regular IDA FFY 21 funds, again at the department's discretion. Unlike for Part B, the increase is all in the FFY 21 funds. There is not a separate ARP Act award, but they do get this increase proportionate to the increase in funding that states received. So as a result, you're only getting one GAN for your 21 grant award. There is no need to provide a separate Section 3 for the outlying areas. Next slide, please. So for the freely associated states in the BIE, it's again a little bit of a different story. There is by statute no discretion given to the funding level for the freely associated states. There's a level funding until reauthorization. As such, freely associated states were not eligible for any of the IDA ARP Act funds. Next slide, please. And similarly for the BIE, the amount of funds that the BIE gets is determined under the terms of the Appropriations Act. And based on that Appropriations Act, there's essentially a cap on the funding level that the BIE received. As a result, there is no additional ARP Act funds for the BIE based on these provisions in the Appropriations Act. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, we made it through all the information I wanted to share through our slides on the ARP Act, and we're going to pause here to see what questions we have. And I am going to ask my colleague Stephen Bird to be available to answer any questions that I won't be able to as well.
Thanks, Matt. We have a good number of questions that have come in through the question and answer tab. Just a reminder, if you would like to ask a question, you can either raise your hand or click on the Q&A option in your control panel. There was a number of questions that came in about where people can find the PowerPoint slides and recording. I put that link in the chat again, but basically it's on the Osep Ideas That Work website on our MSIP page. And so it'll be there in the coming days. So the first question that came in is from Steve Smith, who asks, when will Osep make the determinations information public?
I'm not I don't have that information. I don't know if Greg does. I'm not, Greg.
Yeah, I'll answer that real quickly.
Thank you.
It went out to states today and Tuesday. We will be posting a fact sheet, hopefully tomorrow, and we will be getting the actual determination letters up sometime in the next few days, probably early next week, Steve.
Great, thanks, Greg. The next question comes from Beth Cole. What is the timing of when states can expect the ARP GAN?
So you will be getting the ARP GAN, and the funds will be released at the same time as the regular IDA funds on July 1st.
Great. Next question is from Jennifer Story, and this might have been answered earlier on, but I'll ask again just for clarity's sake. Can you please confirm whether districts with mandatory CCEIS due to significant disproportionality are required to also spend 15% of their ARP IDEA funds in addition to 15% of their regular IDEA Part B funds for CCEIS?
Yes, that is correct. That was talked about in one of the slides about some of the specific calculations that need to be done. You have to use an aggregate of both the ARP IDA funds and the regular FY21 funds in the calculations. And as I said, we'll be providing a little bit more guidance on how to do that through the fact sheet.
Great, thank you. Next question is from Neil Stevens. Are ARP funds subject to reallocation procedures for new and expanding charter schools?
Yes, absolutely. It's again, all of the same provisions under IDA apply to ARP Act. You have to follow those same provisions.
Great, thanks. Next question is from Danny McCarthy. Matt, did you say that we had to provide separate GANs for IDA and IDA ARP to our LEAs?
Yes, you should be providing separate grant notices to them, just like we will be to you.
Great. Next one asks for Part C, Section 3 for ARP. Do we need to mail and email or just email, or just mail?
I believe that you just need to email it to the email box that was provided for your grants to submit them electronically.
Great. Next question is from Robin Lamonis. The FFY21 IDA Part B, Section 619, Table 2 does not appear to include the ARP funding as the 611 table does. Should we add the ARP funds to the amount indicated on the 619 table we received?
That should have included the ARPAC funds. Stephen, can you address that?
The issue was the table that we sent out.
Yes.
All the tables should have included ARP Act funding as a separate column that got added to the traditional columns in the table. So they should have been reflected on that table. So if you've got a version that doesn't include that, let us know and we'll make sure you have the right version of it.
All right, so Robin, if you wanna add some more information. Oh, Robin just said ours was not reflected. So,
Robin, if you could follow up either with me or your state lead, we'll check on it, but I can't check on it right now. Thank you.
great. Okay, next question is from Mark Linsky. Please provide a great deal more information about the necessary documentation and allowability of the then freed up state and local funds that would be used for other allowable expenditures. What type of documentation? How can these amounts be verified? And how does a district prove such expenditures?
Yeah, we will be providing additional guidance on what the requirements are around this. So please just stay tuned for that. We'll get it to you as soon as we can.
Great. Next question says, thank you for addressing BIE, outlying areas, freely associated states with all of us so we can understand. Extremely concerning that the BIE was not eligible for ARP funds. Anything that can be done about this now or in the future?
Well, this is based on, as I mentioned, the Appropriations Act. So it is the decision ultimately of Congress for the provisions for that. I don't know, Stephen, if there's anything else you would want to add, but that's, I think, the bottom line.
Yeah, I think that's the bottom line. Congress, 15 years ago, at least at this point, overrode the statutory reservation for the BIE, which is set at 1.226% of the overall appropriation. Beginning in, I think, fiscal year 2006, they began to override it and say that BIE's allocation was determined by the greater of the increase in the appropriation or inflation, by the lesser of those, so long as it never got less than it did in the preceding year. At this point, the administration has continued that proposal moving forward. We don't have any alternatives that we've seen. We haven't heard concerns about it. And as I said, the BIE, we do include some data in our budget request about the BIE's allocation, what the statutory version versus the Appropriations Act version of the allocation would look like. But ultimately, as Matt said, that is something that is at the behest of Congress, and it's something that's been in place for about 15 years. That being said, I don't think Congress really envisioned necessarily a $2.6 billion increase in a single year when they were doing it. So this is a little bit unique.
Thank you. Another question from Robin Lamonis. Will the ARP IDA funds affect CEIS calculations and privately placed proportionate share?
Yes, and I see the next question also relates to it. Our 611, 619 ARP fund subject to private school proportionate share calculations. The answer is yes. Again, you have to add in both sets of regular IDA funds and the ARP Act funds for any required comprehensive coordinated early intervention services as a result of significant disproportionality. You would also, the 15% for voluntary CIS would be based on sets of funds, and the proportionate share calculations have to be done on all the funds.
Great, thanks so much. Next question is from Rachel Zelmer. Hi, we have an idea of how to track the funds at the LEA level. SEA is easy. and not do separate Part B applications. Will our state contact be able to give us an opinion on whether or not it will work, or should we go straight to Matt?
Rachel, probably you can just go ahead and email me and copy your state lead as well. I may need to consult, but we'll do our best to help you.
Great. Next question is from Lisa Profelsky-Rosa. Will the Q&A documents / fact sheets for ARP funds be sent to directors first? How will they be distributed?
I believe the hope is that we will be able to send them out. If it's cleared at the same time the funds are sent out, there will be a press release and a link to the fact sheet. Greg, do you have any other information on how it will be sent out ultimately?
No, Matt, that's basically the same answer I would have provided. No additional information.
Right. I'm not, how many, we have a lot more questions or just a few?
We have 3 more questions.
Okay, let's get through those.
All right, let's get through them. So Lisa Parker asks, must LEAs meet requirements in last year's determination process in order to reduce MOE?
The answer to that is that an LEA must meet requirements in order to reduce MOE. I have to look back. I think there is maybe some flexibility about which year's determination is used, but so look for that in our upcoming information.
Great, thank you. Next question. If districts are unable to expend increased proportionate share obligations in FFY21, how long will the districts be required to carry forward that obligation?
Well, I think that functions the same way as for the regular IDA funds, and I think we have information in our private school Q&As, but the bottom line is that a good faith effort has to be made to use it for that purpose. There is a point in time towards the end of the period of obligation in which LEAs may use it for other allowable purposes if they're able to document that they're unable to use it for proportionate share purposes, but we'll try to provide more detailed information on that.
Great, thanks. And our last question is from Tracy Coleman. I want to make sure I heard correctly. Due to statute, additional ARP related funding is not available to support state set aside activities or state administration for 611 Part B. Please clarify. Thank you.
So I'll let Stephen correct me if I say any of this wrong, as he often does. But in essence, the additional ARP funds does not increase the amount of funds that you're able to reserve for state level activities, other states level activities, or state administration under Section 611. And this is because the increases are any increases based on inflation, not the total amount of the allocation. Stephen, anything you want to add or clarify to that?
No, I think that's it. The amount is essentially set by inflation, and it doesn't matter if the appropriation goes up, goes down, stays the same. It's an inflationary increase every year. So when the appropriation goes way up very high, you only get inflation. In the years in which, back in the sequestration years of 2013, when the appropriation got cut fairly severely, the amounts did not go down. So that's just the way the statute does it. So we don't get, there's no flexibility in that.
That's the last question. So this is all entitlement. I guess that's one way of putting it. Thank you. Okay, I think that's the last of our Q&As. Great. Thank you all so much. We will continue to answer questions as they come, provide more guidance. We appreciate your patience with all of this. I do want to now put on my other hat and talk about DMS. We are excited to note that the integrated monitoring, sustaining compliance, and improvement protocols are now posted on our website. There is a link in this PowerPoint for them through our DMS 2.0 website. And we want to just give you a little bit of information on these protocols, and we will be coming back to them later this year. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to my colleague for right now, Danny Rice. Thank you, Danny.
Next slide, please. So thank you for your patience. We posted the protocols. Hold on one second. Okay. Sorry, we posted the following protocols on our main DMS 2.0 page. Part B and Part C, integrated monitoring, and Part B and C, sustaining compliance and improvement. Both protocols are applicable for both Part B and C and reflect adjustments we have made based on feedback we received through focus groups. Next slide. So first, we want to really, on behalf of Osep, I want to thank everyone for participating in focus groups. And I want to go over what the purpose of the focus groups were. As part of the DMS 2.0 initiative, all IDA Part B and Part C programs are being monitored by Osep on their general supervision systems using a 5-year cycle. At the request of Osep, IDA Part B and Part C TA centers conducted a series of focus groups to gather state staff feedback on 2 draft protocols, as Matt mentioned, integrated monitoring and sustaining compliance and improvement. The TA centers that were involved with the focus groups were ECTA, DAISY, NCSI, and IDC. OSEP funded TA centers conducted 5 focus groups with state staff in late April and provided opportunity for written feedback through May 7th. In total, 40 Part B states and 18 Part C states were represented. Focus group participants were asked to provide feedback on the following questions. Is the structure and format of the protocols clear and easy to understand? Do states find the protocols useful as they prepare for DMS 2.0 monitoring? Does the organization of the protocols make sense? And are the protocols comprehensive about the specific topic, that is sustaining compliance or integrated monitoring? And any additional comments or suggestions? Next slide, please. So some of the key themes that emerged across the 5 focus groups were the following. Some state staff felt that the protocols were too focused on compliance. There was some concern that the protocols did not allow for review and discussion of integrated state systems, but rather continued to isolate general supervision components. States asked for clarification on terminology and themes used in protocols. And some state staff noted that there were redundancies in protocols and recommended making them one standalone protocol. In terms of format issues, there were those that thought the use of tables would be helpful, as well as having protocols in landscape format. Some state staff felt having a separate Part C and Part B protocol would be helpful. States asked for more contextual or supportive information, such as definitions and examples. States asked OSEP to provide a supplementary or summary checklist of requirements that states are expected to meet. Next slide, please. Again, want to reiterate how thankful we are for all the state feedback we received in the focus groups. The first point we would like to emphasize is that OSEP is absolutely committed to integrating compliance and results. Throughout the 8 puzzle pieces, OSEP has intentionally ensured that compliance and results are integrated across protocols, as the 2 areas are not mutually exclusive, and a focus on both will lead to improved outcomes for infants, toddlers, and students with disabilities. OSEP appreciates the feedback on the importance of ensuring that our review and discussion of state system is not in isolation and that general supervision components are integrated across the 8 puzzle pieces and accompanying protocols. We appreciate the request to provide more clarification of key terms and themes, and we'll consider putting together a glossary. We think that looking at monitoring in 2 stages is helpful. As a reminder, we don't have to ask all the questions in the protocols. As information is addressed, we will make sure to note it and attempt to avoid redundancy. We acknowledge that at times, we may feel like we're asking the same question, but this is often just to make sure we at OSEP have a clear understanding of the state's response to the question. In response to state feedback, since DMS 2.0 rolled out, we have changed terminology from basic requirements to general information. In addition, we have listed all the questions and used hyperlinks at the start for easy reference. While we appreciate the request for tables and landscape views. For reasons of 508 compliance, we are sticking with format. However, please note that the blank templates are in Word and states are free to manipulate them for their own purposes. Initially, we did plan to have separate Part C and Part B protocols, but soon realized there was little difference with the questions being asked. Osep will continue to provide more context through TA calls and new documents. And in terms of checklists, Osep funded TA centers already have many tools that may be helpful and are happy to collaborate to meet each state's specific needs. At this point, I'll turn it back to Matt, who will go over the protocols in more detail. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. We can go to the next slide, please. So just wanted to emphasize one thing about the protocols that I think is important based on the feedback. Just recognize that ultimately these protocols are meant as tools for Osep to collect the information that we need to conduct the monitoring. We believe that they're useful tools for you, that they can, if you decide to use them as self-assessments, but they're organized in a way to help us collect the information that we need. And then, as Danny suggested, there are ways of making them useful for you. So just keep that in mind. Also keep in mind that we are not asking you to fill out these protocols. You can do it for your own purposes if you want to, but we are using them to collect the information we want. We don't necessarily go through, as Danny mentioned, question by question. Sometimes we will get the information we need to answer a specific question by looking at your documentation and perhaps just confirm it from there. I want to just spend a few minutes just orienting you towards these protocols. As I've mentioned before, we anticipate in a future DMS-TA call going through some of the details of these protocols a little bit more, so you're prepared for working through the DMS process, but right now we just want to give you a sense of them. In our last DMS call, Kate did go through the basic template that is largely the same as what you see here with a few changes. So this is in some way a repeat of it. What you see on this slide here is what appears on all the DMS protocols that we'll be rolling out in the future following the same template, with the exception of the title at the top. We begin with the overview, which provides some basic explanation and talking about DMS through the implementation. Next slide, please. The protocols are organized as described in this slide. So once we get beyond that overview, we start with the questions, the overarching areas that are related to the particular monitoring component. We then move into a section on general information. As Danny referenced, we changed the title of this to be clear that not everything in this is specifically a regulation, but it's a listing of statements about the things that we think a state would need to be able to effectively answer the questions that we have. The next section are possible follow-up questions. These are a list of things that we think we might need to ask to dive deeper into these overarching questions. There are examples of what we may ask. We might ask additional questions. We might not ask all of the questions on there, but we thought it was useful to include them for you to be able to see, for you to be able to think about your own systems and be transparent in the kinds of things that we'll be looking for. The final section is the area or issues for follow-up. These are issues which possibly, if verified, could be non-compliance. They also might be just areas that we think that would benefit from more technical assistance or further discussion. So again, these are things that may come up based on a particular situation within a state. Next slide, please. I wanted here just to highlight, this is the beginning of the substance of the protocol, and you'll see the definition of that, and then we start with the suggested documents to review. A few things about the documents, and we've talked about some of this before. The list of documents are things that we think would be useful for us to be able to look at in order to examine the issues that we're looking at. We in no time expect a state to create something that's on this list that they don't already have at this time. If we did, most of these things are not required by regulation, we just find them useful. There may be some things that are required, and we'll let you know about that in the future. But mostly this is a list of things that we think would be useful. One of the changes we made to the protocol is consistent with the way that we are approaching phase 1 of DMS versus phase 2. And this was in response to some of the feedback that we got. We divided between phase 1 and phase 2, and you'll see that in phase 1, we're focusing on policies and procedures. In phase 2, we're focusing on implementation. So for example, for monitoring, we're asking for a written policies and procedures on monitoring during phase 1, but during phase 2, we'll actually want to look at sample monitoring reports. Next slide, please. So one of the changes we made to the protocol based on feedback that we got is that we begin after the document section, we list all of the overarching questions in order, A, B, C, etc., right at the top. They all have the links to the regulations that they're tied to. And this way you can see all the main questions that we're going to be asking. Further on, as you will see, we include those same set questions, like question A, with the other sections, the follow-up questions in the area for follow-up that we'll talk about in the next slides. Thank you. Next slide, please. I wanted to note this is the first overarching question that we ask about, and I wanted to highlight one thing in here. As Danny mentioned, one of the things that we heard through the focus sections was a concern, focus sessions. There was a concern that we were focused too heavily on compliance and not enough on results. And the way we've tried to approach this is rather than looking at compliance and results separately, we are trying to integrate them together because, as Danny said, we see them functioning together. So if you look at this question, it is asking both about how state's general supervision system identifies non-compliance and how it looks at improved results and functional outcomes. So that is consistent through most of the questions that we have here and through our other protocols. And you'll see here, this is again, an example of the overarching question, moving on to the general information that we think is important for this question. Next slide, please. And then we go on to list the possible follow-up questions that we've talked about and the areas or issues for follow-up. Next slide. Finally here, again, this is are the links to the protocols that are available on our DMS 2.0 website. We encourage you to take a look at them, start reading them, look at them with your staff. If you're interested, the TA centers are more than ready to engage with you. They will be doing a number of activities around this. And as I mentioned a couple of times already, we will be coming back to talk about these in more detail in coming national TA calls later this summer or in the early fall. Okay, next slide, please. And just finally then, just in terms of next steps, know that we are working hard to get out the remaining protocols, data dispute resolution, technical assistance, and professional development. These protocols will be available and released by October when we resume DMS 2.0 monitoring activities. And we're going to continue working with our technical assistance centers to find the best ways to solicit feedback on the protocols as we move them forward. We really appreciate all the information we got through the focus groups, and we look forward to continued collaboration from there. And with that, we have a few minutes left if there are any questions. Looks like 3 minutes left.
don't see any questions in the questions tab.
Okay.
And I don't see any hands raised. So I think we might have gotten them all
Well,
last
that's
time
great.
around.
Well, again, I've said this a number of times in several contexts. We greatly appreciate your patience, or at least your patience publicly with us as we try to roll out the protocols, as we get you information about ARP Act funds. We want to get you the best information as soon as we can, and sometimes those two things are a little bit conflicting. So we're doing what we can with that. Please feel free to get in touch with us through your state leads, or you can contact me directly. And I wish everybody a good evening. I don't know if Greg or David have any final words for our colleagues. Otherwise, we can say goodnight.
No, no final words. Thank you, Matt and team.
And I reposted the link to our MSIP page where the recording, PowerPoint slides, everything else will be posted in the coming days.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Swati, for your assistance. Thank you, Stephen, for joining us and helping me answer the questions, and everybody have a great night.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.